What's driving you right now?
I think the same thing that probably always drives me, which is an intense curiosity about how to support communities to do what they love. I've thought for a long time that there is a kind of maieutic vocation. That's a great word I love from Socratic philosophy, which comes from the Greek maieutic. It comes from the Greek word for midwife. And when Socrates used it, it meant to bring latent ideas into consciousness. And I think that a lot of my work in the world is about bringing latent communities into visibility, where there is some collective dream that's trying to be born that isn't yet fully formed in the way that a pregnancy would happen. It's not that it doesn't have an intention and direction and maybe even a DNA that's somehow known in the ancestry of the community, but it hasn't yet come to birth. It's still actively being shaped. And often it's a collectively held dream coming to birth. And I think part of my role in the world has been to really be a kind of midwife, to stand in solidarity with those who are trying to give birth, to not be terrified by the messiness of it, to be intent and joyful about the promise of it, and to be willing to be there while they both go through the labor pains and also be there to celebrate when something comes to birth, and to talk about what it really takes for the child to survive in the world. So, I have the privilege, and it's a huge privilege, of doing that all over the world. What drives that, curiously, is just a love of people and what they're able to create, and irrepressible hope that because we're creative as human beings and because we long to make a difference, that when you bring people together, they're capable of really being with and for each other around things that matter. And I get to see that over and over again in many cultures and many countries and many languages. And it's always full of surprise, because the promise of life is surprising and attractive and terrifying in all the ways that giving birth is. There's a related thing that's really been driving me lately, and it is related because it's a kind of concrete manifestation of that same set of concerns and interests, which is that 4 years ago, I started a global maternal health project called Ubu Mama. And I started it because I found out from my oldest sister, who works for the World Health Organization, about the number of women dying in childbirth, which is almost 600,000 a year, that those deaths are almost entirely preventable, and that they're happening to women, poor women of color, simply because they're invisible and we don't care enough to save their lives. Not because there's any technical challenge, not because it's even difficult, but just because we don't care enough. And because I'm always interested in things that connect people in meaningful ways across generations and cultures, and because I'm intensely committed to standing in solidarity with those who create, I started thinking that this was a really concrete example of an area in which new partnerships were needed. Most of the women that are dying, not surprisingly, are in the youngest generation. They're 15 or 16 or 18 or 20. Because it affects poor, invisible women, it's an issue that will be an orphan issue in their own countries because they'll never have the power necessary to make the change. Curiously, it's an issue around which there's already a Millennium Development Goal. MDG 5 is specifically focused on reducing maternal mortality by 75%, and it's one of the only Millennium Development Goals in which almost no progress is being made. So I started thinking about, what can happen on a local level that also really builds partnerships and interests and a sense of meaning and purpose across cultures and worlds and generation. And so we started this small, Ubu Mama project, which was quite simply to go in, ask women in communities where there's a very high incidence of maternal death and childbirth about their stories of giving birth. And to then have them take those stories, draw them, bring them to visible expression in a creative way, and then embellish them onto a garment that a pregnant woman would wear in their community, native dress that would be worn by a pregnant woman, with the intention that that would create a micro enterprise for the women. They would be paid and commissioned to do this garment. We would bring a skilled birth attendant, a midwife, into the sewing circle so that as the stories and myths surfaced, that there was someone there to really educate and and engage in dialogue about safe motherhood with the women. And that at the end, the women were invited to compose jointly a message to the world about what they wanted the world to understand about their situation as mothers and mothers at risk. The intention there was that in many of these communities, women are so isolated and birth has become such a privatized matter that women really aren't allowed to have empowering conversations with each other, even around things that are life or death issues for them. But we knew that if we gave them a requirement essentially to come to voice collectively around something, that they would talk to each other about their own experience and then also formulate it into something that had a focus and intention and invitation to the rest of the world. So we've done that, and without any funding or staff, we've managed to do it in 9 countries, 8 in Africa and India. And when I arrived here at this meeting on the 25th, it was a really, really banner day for Ubu Mama, because on Thursday, the UN had a special day of focus. It was the opening day of the General Assembly, but they had a special event day to focus attention on the Millennium Development Goals. And that morning, the Director General of WHO hosted a breakfast for the First Ladies of the world. And Ubu Mama was the exhibit in the room. And that night at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, they did a ritual ceremony presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Anglican Observer to the UN, also in support of the Millennium Development Goals. And the Ubu Mama garments were worn in procession and were the exhibit at the reception. And, so both of those were a kind of, to me it was thrilling, not because the project had visibility, but because I had promised those women at the grassroots level that if they were willing to add their stories and voices, that I would promise to help make them visible in the world so that people could rally around their lives. And so the fact that that happened this week has just been so thrilling to me. And that's really been a labor of love in my life that has been very, very, very important to me for the last 4 years, and where I can also see the potential of this really sort of serving the intention for which, doing that for which it was purposed, which is to raise partnerships that support those who create, and that also raise these questions in communities of all kinds, communities here and communities in the developing world. And because I spend much of my time in the developing world, I really do care about lives that are being wasted and can be saved.
Well, it's amazing how your metaphor, you have a living metaphor, and you started with a big Imagine project, and you went right down to the local, and then right down to the garment, and then you came back up to the UN, and now it's global. And again, there's the garment there too. It's a beautiful metaphor.
Well, as I was saying in the workshop that I taught yesterday, I really think that the Imagine movement at its best really has simply stood for the possibility of inspired action. That we really, as human beings, have enormous imagination about what matters and what inspires us to act, and that we can act on that imagination in ways that are utterly practical. And Ubu Mama is an example of that. You know, it's really a good, safe motherhood education project at the local level, and it's really inspired people to pay attention in a new way on a global basis. And it's been done without any of the resources that people say are necessary to make that kind of impact. And that also makes me really happy.
And it's the power of dialogue, too.
That's right.
It brings us right back to this.
That's right.